My name is Alina. I am a professor over at the law school where I co-teach the Immigrant Rights Clinic. So in addition to teaching students about immigration law and policy, I work with law students to represent immigrants who are facing deportation and detention. And I work with community organizations on immigrant rights campaigns. One of the people I have the pleasure of representing is Ravi Ragbir, who is the executive director of the New Sanctuary Coalition, who incredibly unjustly and horrifically was detained 2 weeks ago. And we are currently in the middle of fighting his detention and his deportation, and I will talk more about that threat to the New Sanctuary movement tonight. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to cover, I am going to lay out just briefly a little bit of context for those of you who may not be as familiar with how the immigration system works today. And then the bulk of what I want to cover is to talk about the movement itself, the New Sanctuary movement. How does it look today? How is it different from the past? What are the components? And then, time permitting, I can talk a little bit more about the idea of sanctuary policies, laws, sanctuary cities, sanctuary campuses. So just to jump into the context, there are essentially 5 facts that I hope that we can get on the same page about when it comes down to the immigration and the deportation system. The first is that it's massive. So there are at least 400,000 people who are forcibly deported from the United States each year. So it's like nearly 500,000. That number, goes up and down as policies go. And then in addition to that, there are hundreds of thousands of more who are essentially forced out of the country, maybe not through formal deportation, but through other policies that relate to immigration. So we're talking about massive numbers of people, the vast majority of people of color each year. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 that you need to understand is that any non-citizen can be deported. So often when we talk about deportation, people immediately think of a category that they talk about as undocumented people, people who don't have immigration status. And that's true that many of the people who are subject to deportation are undocumented, but the deportation machine reaches everyone, and these days is even going after naturalized citizens to some extent. But we talk about folks who have refugee status, who actually did manage to get a very narrow asylum grant in this country. They can still be deported. Green card holders can still be deported. Many of my clients are people who have status, but are facing deportation because of long ago interaction in the criminal justice system, or some sort of accusation of an immigration violation that comes up in their record when they apply to naturalize. So essentially, it's a very expansive machine, and only citizenship protects you from deportation. And as I said, even that potentially could be a challenge. When you are facing deportation, and this is something that Andrew alluded to, when you're facing deportation, the system is very bureaucratic. So you might expect, if you are going to be forced out of a country, if you're going to be banished, that would be considered a punishment. And a lot of the laws that we all know are associated with the criminal legal system would apply, that you would have the right to an attorney, that you would see a judge, that you would have what we like to describe as due process of law. Unfortunately, that's not the case in the immigration system. There is no right to counsel when you're facing deportation. You can try and find someone, and some places like New York City are better than others in terms of trying to provide free legal services. But the government does not have to provide you with an attorney in order to deport you. And they don't even necessarily have to put you in front of a judge. And that's a complicated area about whether you'll get to see a judge or not if you're facing deportation. But there are many people who get deported, and it's just an immigration officer making a decision about that without any sort of semblance of like a trial. So that's the third fact. The fourth fact is that there's no clear path to citizenship for many people. There's no clear path to relief. Again, Andrew mentioned that asylum law, for example, is very limited in terms of the types of grounds it recognizes as being protective of people. So many people are fleeing very dangerous, very violent situations, and they don't fit under the actual laws that establish what asylum is. And the same can be said for citizenship. There's often a refrain, people should just get in line, they should apply. Why didn't they apply a long time ago? There's no line, there's no application process for most people who don't have status. And so these are just basic facts about the immigration system being broken. And when I say broken, this leads me to my fifth and final fact, just for context setting. It's not broken because somebody thought they were doing a good job with the immigration system and didn't realize that there were these flaws. It's broken by design. And that goes to a lot of the history that was just laid out. Our immigration laws have always been based on a white supremacist model. It's been very protectionist. The laws were that we lived in a society here in the United States where we had the most open borders and the least amount of immigration rules when voluntary migration was mostly white. As that shifted, that's when you started seeing these rules that became very complicated, very openly racist for about a century. And then now that as open racism became less easy to have in our laws, those got replaced with a lot of the provisions that are more about criminalization, about saying, well, we have these rules, everyone has to follow them, even though by design and by history, only a very small subset of people can follow them, and people of color in this country who are either being pushed or pulled into the United States often are just not eligible. So that's just the 5 pieces that I wanted to lay out as background. Obviously, I encourage folks to really learn more about the system, and if you have any questions about this, because it's easy to sit here and say it's racist, if you want to have some background reading about the history, and I know some of this will be covered in future classes, and we can also post some resources on the class site. So I guess the first question I wanted to throw out to you is really one that has to do with how you think about the new sanctuary movement today and how it's different. You heard a summary about how the sanctuary movement in the 1980s was about a lot of churches who were coming out there to really really protest the way that Central American refugees were being treated, and taking people physically into their churches and facing a lot of backlash because of that. And so part of what we want to do is to talk about, well, how does this look today? Many of the people who are now part of the sanctuary movement are not necessarily refugees. Many of the people who are the families who have decided to take physical sanctuary in churches and are being kind of sponsored by many of the organizations are people who have lived here for a very long time. They've lived here for a very long time in the United States. They're facing deportation. Their kids are being taken away from them. And so it's a much more expansive group. It's also not just people, as I mentioned before, who are undocumented, who are facing deportation because of their undocumented status. It includes people who wouldn't necessarily traditionally put on a pedestal as the poster children for the immigrant rights movement. It includes people who are facing deportation because of criminal convictions. And the New Sanctuary movement has been very open about how that doesn't matter. It's not the narrative of good versus bad immigrants is a narrative that is used to divide our communities. And so what we need to focus on is the unfairness of the deportation system. So the type of person who is being supported through this movement has definitely changed. It comes from the same seed that the original sanctuary movement came in, about the idea of welcoming individuals and in the, I guess, Judeo-Christian tradition, welcoming the stranger, like that seed is still there, but it's very much an idea that we're not going to count on the government embodying those ideals, and that New Sanctuary itself can create them in a different form. So it's not just about physical sanctuary, the idea of a physical protection or even a daring of the government to like coming into this church and get this person if you really want to get them. It's not just about that, it's about a whole panoply of things. So this is a video that actually illustrates the work that the New Sanctuary Coalition of New York City is doing here. Looking at that video, there are two buildings that were shown there. 26 Federal Plaza, which is a building in downtown Manhattan, where people go to immigration court, and they also go to check in on a regular basis with ICE officers, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so they go in and they check in, and at any moment they may walk into that building and be ordered deported or be taken into custody. So each week, New Sanctuary Coalition does a walk around the building, which they call a Jericho walk. And it's basically from a story, and I am not Christian, so please forgive me if I get this wrong. Basically a story about how if you walk around a building 7 times and you pray, you can make the building fall down. And so that is what they do, is that they walk around these buildings in peaceful prayer. They do a prayer, and then it's a silent march, a prayer and a silent march, with the hope that the injustice of that building will fall down. Although, as Ravi likes to point out, 26 Federal Plaza is actually sinking into the ground, and that's why there's a lot of construction around it. The other building you saw was 201 Varick Street. That's just a close walk from here. It's probably gone there because the post office is next to it. That's actually the detained immigration court in New York City. So there are people literally locked up in chains in that building, having their immigration court hearings, and then being shuttled back and forth to a number of detention jails around the city, not in New York City, but in New Jersey and in Goshen, New York, and being brought back and forth for their immigration court hearings. And they do the same thing. Once a week, they walk around that building in solidarity. The pieces of ice there, obviously that's a double entendre, am I using that correctly? In the sense that ICE is the very interestingly chosen acronym for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It leads to a lot of helpful protest sayings, and then this concept of melting ice, which they've used. What else did people see in the video? This accompaniment program, this idea that no one should have to go through this system alone, and that faith communities in particular can use the mantra of bearing witness to the injustice of actually being trained to go with them as they check in, to go with them to court. Again, in a system where there's no right to counsel, the idea is that every person in this country should be able to walk in solidarity with somebody who's facing this kind of injustice. And so those trainings happen. Some volunteer lawyers, but many volunteers who are not lawyers, helping people understand what the rules are for asylum. We now live in a world where if you don't apply for asylum within your first year of coming to the US, you just can't apply at all. There's exceptions that we always fight about in the courts, but a lot of what this is helping people understand what they need to do to get their paperwork in order and to pair people with volunteer attorneys when they're available. But if you saw those long lines and people sitting, they've been overwhelmed with people who need help. So all of these pieces, and obviously you saw protests, marches, these pieces are part of what the New Sanctuary movement is. It is trying to be an expansive component to really to bring people who are not in the system into it as much as possible, and help those who are in the system to get out of it and to see that they're supported, and that the injustice that they see in the courts, in their check-ins, and in detention, doesn't represent how many people in this country, not all obviously, but many people in this country feel. So it's an important part of the story. So what we're seeing in this video, is about the sanctuary movement right now, the protests, the partnership, the accompaniment, bearing witness, fighting for change, not worrying about lawyers or what the laws require, and just doing what needs to be done to help people. That's the movement. What is a sanctuary city? Do we live in a sanctuary city here in New York? What do people think?
Yeah, but it's fake.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but it's fake. What is the detainer law, the anti-detainer law that we have here? Folks know how it works? Yeah, so this is a pretty complicated area. The first thing to understand is that we've long had a funnel from police interactions into the deportation system in every part of the country. Where, as I said earlier, where we used to have laws that just said, oh, you're from this country, you can't come here. as those went away, it suddenly became about a whole series of complicated rules and procedures. And if you stepped outside of the line from immigration rules, you'd be punished. And if you stepped outside the line on any sort of criminal violation, you'll be punished in the criminal system and then in the immigration system again. And so there's been a funnel for a long time where if you ended up being arrested, you're smoking marijuana outside of your dorm, and police officers come, they arrest you, they decide to actually take you in to a precinct, you end up getting booked. It was very common throughout the country for people to then be taken from those jail facilities and said, oh, and you happen to be a non-citizen, I'm going to take you and now I'm going to put you in immigration jail, or I'm going to take you and I'm going to start a deportation case. So that funnel was there for a long time. And a detainer, as you were saying, is a mechanism by which ICE says, oh, I see you have someone in your jail who is a non-citizen. I don't care what happens to his or her case. Maybe she's innocent. Maybe it was a false arrest. I really don't care. Now I found this person. I want you to do me a solid, and before you actually release him or her, let me know, and then hold on to them for a couple of days so I can come and pick them up. That's essentially what a detainer is. It's a paper request, but that's what they're asking for. So policies that are anti-detainer policies are simply saying, we are not going to hold you, we're not going to hold someone and then let you come and get them. Stronger policies are like, we're not going to hold them and we're not going to tell you that they're here or when we would release them. But essentially that is the core of what jurisdictions talk about when they say that they have sanctuary laws or trust laws, welcoming laws, is to say, like, we're just not going to comply with that part of the process. Now that's a pretty limited part of the process in which people get picked up by deportation. And I guess this is bringing us now to New York City specifically. So, some people were saying it's not really a sanctuary city. Why is this policy itself, to the extent people know, not as protective as it sounds? ICE agents can, if they get the information somehow, and I'll talk about that in a minute, they can still come and find someone. They conduct every day, throughout the country, they conduct home arrests where they go to people's homes. They say, we can't take you in jail. We'll just go to your house, we'll go to your workplace, we'll go to another place we think you might be. So the policies are limited in part because throughout the country, in every state, including California and including New York City, every jurisdiction, there's a program called Secure Communities. And Secure Communities means that once you are fingerprinted, your fingerprint, for any reason, if you're fingerprinted by the police, your fingerprints are shared with the Department of Homeland Security. And so at that moment, even if New York City or California or wherever you are agrees to not hold on to you and hand you over to ICE, your fingerprints are already in the system and ICE already knows that you exist. And so because of Secure Communities, because of this fingerprinting program, policies like broken windows policing, fare beating policies in the subway, all of that creates a problem because even if New York City says, don't worry, we're not gonna hand you over to ICE, we're not gonna hold on to you so ICE can come and get you, if they're going into your community and they are arresting you and you actually get fingerprinted for that arrest, if you are a person who has no status or is deportable for other reasons, you're automatically flagged to the Department of Homeland Security. And then they come and they surveil you and they pick you up outside your home or they pick you up while you're dropping your kid off at school. So that's the way in which policing policies are important. Now, New York City has made some strides on this, like they have tried to shift people, certain offenses away from fingerprintable offenses to not because they understand this issue, but we're at the very nascent stages. And as long as you have policies that support any sort of expansion of criminal legal system policing issues, particularly in communities of color, you're going to see this kind of double punishment effect because detainer policies break one part of the chain but not the other. One other limitation on New York's law and many of the laws across the country is that they have carve-outs. So sometimes they say, we are going to cooperate depending on the type of conviction or charge someone's facing, which again creates this like dual system of justice. So that's another way that it's limited. But given what they're doing what they're doing, and we've heard that one of the reactions of the Trump administration is to try and defund them. The Trump administration, like I said before, made a really broad statement in the beginning about how they were going to go after all funding. Cities sued, and that's kind of percolated in the courts. So far, those lawsuits have been successful, where they've said, courts have said, you can't force, the federal government cannot force a locality to do its bidding by saying they're going to take away all of their funding. The funding has to be very connected to what they want them to do. States aren't supposed to be engaging in immigration enforcement, so you can't just make up a connection. The Trump administration has responded by narrowing the type of funding they're taking away, because they're trying to make it closer to what is somewhat related to immigration enforcement. So far, each attempt to do that has been rejected by the courts, but the courts, so far, the litigation has been successful. You see this very corrosive idea that some people deserve deportation permeating so strongly from the Trump, obviously Trump administration, it's a really big group of some people, but it is so powerful that it has permeated to a mayor, de Blasio, who, obviously on many issues is not as progressive as he makes himself out to be, but had been making himself out to be very progressive on immigration issues, really has nothing to lose by being super progressive on immigration issues in New York City, yet somehow is adopting this very surprising line of saying, well, some people, we're not going to give them services. So it does permeate even in very progressive circles. And so you can imagine what it does in areas where it is not, where people are primed to think of anti-immigrant legislation. So you see, for example, SB 4 legislation in Texas, where the Texas state legislature passed a law to try and make it hard for cities and localities in Texas to pass sanctuary laws. That's also being litigated in the courts. And then you see places like Miami, Florida, or Dayton, Ohio, that had progressive or semi-progressive immigration policies that then almost immediately after Trump made his first initial announcements about defunding, abandoned them. So there is an effect that's happening, and even though litigation is really, pushing back against a lot of this, and it has had a lot of success, it's certainly not doing everything that it can be done. And that's why, at least in, from my role as a lawyer, what I like to tell people is that, the law itself is the reason we have so much of the oppression in the system we have. Deportation, all the things that are happening to people are written in law. We can't expect the law to save us from that injustice. It's a tool that people use, I use it, obviously, to try and push back and to fight for people's rights, but it does come back to the movement. So youth activists have been the most successful in our movement, in the immigrant rights movement, of getting anything done over the last 10 years. And DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is a program that the Obama administration implemented to prevent people from being deported, young people who came here as kids and meet certain requirements, from being deported for 2-year periods that were then getting renewed and they could work. That program only exists because activists in the immigrant rights movement and youth who were directly affected fought for something to happen when Congress failed to pass what many of you have probably heard of, the DREAM Act, that would actually provide a real path to citizenship for young people. And so they pushed for that and they fought for it, and it allowed many, many people to really speak out about their situation and educate people about immigrant rights. So, what better program to try and dismantle than DACA if you want to undercut the movement? So that's one very important example. I will just tell you a little bit about Ravi's case. He is the executive director of the organization whose work was just featured here, New Sanctuary Coalition. Ravi himself came to this work because he experienced the system directly. He actually came to the US many years ago. He got a green card. And then when he was working, one of his first good paying jobs after having his daughter, he was working for a bank, and the bank came under investigation for these loans that somebody was funneling through the bank. And so the guy who was funneling in the loans got arrested, and the bank basically pointed their finger at Ravi, saying like, oh, well, you were the one who was, accepting the loans initially, even though he had no power to approve them or anything like that. So this was in the heyday of like people being very aggressive in these banking practices, and he was like the lowest level person, the person who calls you on the phone and says, do you want a loan? That's who he was, and he was the one who ended up getting arrested. So he got arrested, he pled his innocence, but he was convicted at trial, and he got a conviction. Now, for most people, 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record in this country. For most people, you get your conviction, and then you live with the really tough consequences of that conviction, which might affect your ability to get a job or may affect your ability to get student loans. Really tough thing, you might serve some time, you might have to pay a fine. He had all of those things going on. What he didn't realize, even though he was a permanent resident as a green card holder, is that on top of that, he would face deportation. So after he served his time and paid his quote unquote debt to society, he was then taken into an immigration jail. Even though he was from New Jersey, even though he had a young daughter, he was taken to an immigration prison in Alabama, where he spent almost 2 years fighting his case. When he was finally released in 2008, when ICE recognized that he was not a flight risk or a danger, and so they said, we know you're fighting your case, we're going to release you. So he took his experience of being somebody facing deportation who had no idea that the system was as oppressive as it was, meeting all of these people in this jail in Alabama and seeing them, person after person, give up their case and accept deportation because they couldn't stand being incarcerated. He took those experiences and he decided when he moved back to his home here in the tri-state area that he would become an immigrant rights organizer. So he started organizing first with a group called Families for Freedom, which is another group I highly recommend that you learn more about, and eventually became hired to be the executive director of New Sanctuary Coalition. And it was his vision that created the accompaniment program. He leads the Jericho walks with faith leaders each week. He conceptualized the asylum clinics, and he was in the middle of coming up with a city program to try and get the city involved in fighting against the changes to DACA and TPS that were happening recently. When he had it, he reports to ICE, once a year, and he had his check-in in January. So he's been very outspoken about the injustices of the system and knew what he potentially could be walking into, but was taken, we believe, unjustly that day. And so we are now, our clinic, along with his defense committee and the New Sanctuary Coalition, are fighting to get him released and to end his deportation. He is one of at least 4 or 5 prominent immigrant rights leaders who has been picked up by ICE in the last 3-4 weeks. And so the targeting is very real. And it's very explicit in some of the inside conversations we have with ICE. So to that extent, if they're trying to take our leaders, then what is the response from the movement? Like what can the movement do in response to that? Yeah, and that's one of the things I was talking with Ravi today. He's in Orange County Jail in Goshen, New York. And I was talking to him today, and we have a defense committee meeting coming up, and we asked, is there anything you want us to tell the folks at the meeting? And he said that he was really proud of everything that's happened since he was detained. We send him all the news reports, and that he feels like it in some ways he doesn't need to be here because of everything that's risen in his absence, and that sometimes being a target and being taken out of the system can help other people step into those roles in ways that they maybe didn't think they could. And of course, we're like, we need you. So that's nice, but we're bringing you back. But I think leadership development has been a huge part of what he's been doing for many years. And I think many other really effective immigrant rights leaders have really recognized that it is a coalition-based model, that it's non-hierarchical, that we don't need to reproduce some of the hierarchy that we see in other places, and that will keep us stronger when they try and pick us off one by one. Other thoughts on movement responses? Yeah, and I think that is what has been very powerful about this. So, you know, Ravi, so obviously Ravi works for an organization that in and of itself involves churches and other places of worship that take people into physical sanctuary. And so some of the questions have come up, and I'm not going to play this video today, but you should watch some of the other New Sanctuary Coalition videos. I'll play one more that talk about this. But he actually addresses a question about like why not take physical sanctuary, and this idea that he wants to actually expose what's going on. So the week before his check-in, another leader of the New Sanctuary Coalition was taken outside of his home a few weeks before that individual's check-in. So we were all on alert that this could happen. We believe it's unlawful and it's unjust, but we knew it could happen. Exposing this for what it is has its own value, is incredibly powerful. That being said, you know, we want to prevent them from doing it. So on that note, if I can find...
I am Ravi Ragber, Executive Director of the New Sanctuary Coalition. And if you're hearing this, or if you're listening to this, it is because I was taken in by ICE today. What we are asking you to do is, if you want to stop this, you have to act now. Our target is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is the group, this is the agency that you have to stop. This is the agency that you have to talk to stop, to end my detention and end my deportation. Thank you.
I will leave you with that call to action. Each one of you in this room, if you would like, can volunteer for New Sanctuary Coalition. They train everyone wherever you're coming from. Volunteers can be of all different statuses, and they talk about safety and what folks do to join that particular movement. And it's incredibly powerful, and that's what we want to see for Ravi's case, is that when they took him, they didn't realize that they were planting the seeds for 100 more people to take his place, 1,000 more people to take his place. And so we want you to be part of that. Of course, New Sanctuary is not the only group that's doing this amazing work. There's a ton of incredible organizations in New York City that do this work, that can use volunteers, from Families for Freedom to Black Alliance for Just Immigration, to a number of organizations that are organizing on the ground. And we are in a moment, so everything, the videos you're seeing, this all has happened in the last 2 weeks in the city, within walking distance of where we are now. So to the extent, as you spend the rest of the semester learning about the history of this movement, its connection to all other sorts of different social justice movements in this country and globally, I encourage you to think more about also what you can do to be part of the movement as it's happening, because we are at a critical time. And many of you have done incredible work here already on campus to build support for the sanctuary movement here, as well as work, in other parts of the city and the world to do this kind of movement work. And I just encourage those of you who haven't tapped into this, it's happening now, and people are ready to get your energy and enthusiasm. So with that, I will close.